our Democrat of the day comes to us from the House District 52B. Ruth Richardson is kind enough to join us today to talk about some of the legislation that's been coming through, as well as also her race for another term in the Minnesota House. Representative, thank you very much. I appreciate the time.
Thank you so much for having me, Matt.
My pleasure here. Of course, your name came up quite a bit here because in the last special session, you were the person behind the House resolution that declared racism a public health crisis. First of all, fantastic. I'm glad someone stepped up there. Talk a little bit about that and the process that you went through on this.
Sure. Well, and let me start off by saying that this House resolution was a little bittersweet to pass because it's long past due. It should have been done much earlier, but I'm glad that we are here at a point that we finally have some recognition from our institution that racism is indeed a public health crisis and that racism is indeed killing communities. And so it was really great to have that pass with bipartisan support. How we got there, behind the scenes, there was a lot of work going on with police reform bills, if you were, keeping up with that after the murder of George Floyd. And a couple of days after George Floyd's murder, I was talking with members of our Posse Caucus, the People of Color and Indigenous Caucus, and I said, it's long over time that we identify this challenge of racism and the impact on our communities. And the entire caucus was on board, and that's really when the work began. And one of the things that we were just wanted to be sure to highlight is, it's taken us over 400 years to get to where we are today. 400 years of oppression, over 400 years of systemic racism. And so we know that systems that have been built on that system are not going to be changed in a special session, a full session, and that we are, we're gearing up to do this work for the long term because it is definitely going to be a marathon, not sprint.
As a person who, and I think your points are absolutely spot on. I mean, this has taken way too long. There definitively is a difference this time around. There seems to be this very strong voice saying, no, we're not going back. I mean, we've had incidents in the past where a massive level of injustice happens. And people all of a sudden, get out there, oh, isn't this horrible? Isn't this horrible? But we don't change anything. And the fact is, after George Floyd, there are a lot of people, that are starting to step back and say, no, we shouldn't have military bases named after Confederate generals. We shouldn't have Christopher Columbus statues up. There seems to be a difference here that the change is real and palatable this time. Why do you feel this time it's different? Do you think it's just the brutality of what happened to George Floyd, or do you think that something else is going on?
I don't think it's just the brutality, because there has been brutality in this country for centuries.
Yeah.
And I think that, this moment in time, coming off of a global pandemic, we're in the midst of a global pandemic, that really, I think, began to shine a very bright light on just how entrenched the disparities within our systems are, especially from a healthcare perspective. And the COVID pandemic, when we just had a few cases of COVID, we saw the state jump in unison, the House, the Senate, the governor's office, and everyone came together and said, what are we going to do to address this pandemic and this crisis? And that definitely was the right thing to do, but it's also the right thing to do as it relates to this issue as well. And so one of the reasons that I think that we are within this space right now is that people are paying attention. And, part of the COVID pandemic, I think a lot of people were much more focused in on the news cycle. You couldn't turn away from the brutality, the torture that was inflicted on George Floyd. But I also think in this moment, it's really important that even with that renewed attention and focus on thinking about ways that we can begin to dismantle racism, if we're really serious about moving the needle, it's going to require that we are centering the voices of the individuals that are most impacted by the pain of this. Mm-hmm. And one of the concerns that I've had is, what we are asking for is for our institutions to not be racist. And there have been lots of other things that have been happening in terms of, donations here or, maybe Amazon saying things like Black Lives Matter on their home screen. But that doesn't stop the actual act of racism. And so this moment is really beyond like hashtags. It's beyond thinking about viral posts. It's about the actual work that needs to be done to dismantle the structures that have clearly been working the way that they've been designed to work, and the way that they've been designed to work has a very harmful impact on BIPOC communities.
And once again, as you just kind of were touching on there, I think one of the things that's interesting is all we're looking for is a world where everyone gets the same chances, the same opportunities, and yet there still is this element out there saying no, and and that is scary. Speaking of which, I want to get your thoughts on the fact that this was not a unanimous vote in favor of declaring racism a public health crisis. Now, you had one excused Republican. You had a bunch of Republicans that didn't vote. I guess they're going to try to balance on the beam a little bit later on. But you also had quite a few Republicans who seemed to be very angry with you for putting this bill forward and, quickly voted against it. I think we can talk a little bit about the fact that I think that this is them talking to their districts, which is kind of a scary element in its own. But talk a little bit about that, because you would think that something like this, especially after George Floyd, would have been a no-brainer and that this should have passed unanimously.
Well, there's a saying out there, Matt, you can judge a person by who their enemies are. And one of the things that I thought was very heartening is that, again, it was a bipartisan vote, and there were individuals that not only voted yes, but also spoke up in favor of the House resolution and really adding their voice to the fact that this is an issue that's long overdue. I think one of the most frustrating sort of comments during the House debate was a statement that was made that systemic racism doesn't exist. Institutional racism doesn't exist. And that was really, I think, a moment of time for education, because when you really think about racism and the roots of racism within this country, what we know is that it's so deeply entrenched within our systems. And if, in fact, institutional racism did not exist, what I was looking for was, what day did that happen? What time did that happen? And what was going on in the world that was not front-page news to say, today, institutional racism no longer exists. And so I think it's also an opportunity to also educate around misconceptions, because there are also comments made suggesting that the root of all injustice and racism is about education. And if people just, have access to a quality public education, we won't have these issues. But I point to the health disparities that we see in maternal child health outcomes. Mm-hmm. Black women are 3 to 4 times more likely to die during their pregnancy and childbirth than white women. And when you control for education, income, insurance, housing status, they are still more likely to die. Getting a college degree is not saving us from the harmful impact that racism is playing within our systems. And when you look at those women who are dying during childbirth and pregnancy, the real heartbreaking story behind that is the fact that 60% of those deaths are preventable.
And you talk about educating people. I mean, we have to have an education system that hasn't been filtered through a white sieve as well. And the reason I say that is, I mean, when we had the debate about the name Calhoun on the lake, people were saying, well, slavery wasn't that bad. And I looked at them because I've been to the South, and I went and there's a very interesting tour you can take in Charleston, South Carolina, where they talk about over the years, a third of the people, the slaves, died because of malnutrition and starvation. That's not being treated well. That they were starving their own the slaves. This was not some sort of fairy tale where there was just that has been created by white America to not feel as horrible about slavery as they should be. But by having an education system that actually teaches the true history of a Columbus, of the Confederate generals, of how bad slavery was, how the Jim Crow laws happened, how the law and order movement has basically worked against the African-American population, that if you don't have an honest discussion about it, well, you're never going to be able to truly educate everyone.
Well, and if we don't recognize racism as a crisis, we'll never get there, because step one is to have alignment that people understand the harmful impact. And when you think about the brutality of slavery, because it was a brutal institution, and it is a brutal institution, yes, because it still exists, but also thinking about it from the perspective of the economic exploitation. There are generations of individuals who have still not recovered financially when you think about the level of labor that was exploited through a formalized chattel institution of slavery. I have family that are from the South, family that, worked the fields in terms of other systems that had came to rise, including the sharecropper system, which was a system designed to continue to exploit labor as well. The 13th Amendment of our Constitution, you end slavery except for when, someone is incarcerated. So those that level of economic exploitation, to your point, is also another really critical piece of the puzzle in terms of the education around that. And the reality that we have within our own country a precedent for ensuring individuals who have experienced harm actually have an opportunity to receive contributions for that harm. That's something that's never materialized when you think about the brutal institution of slavery.
And, as you talk about that, considering how much money we spend on our military in this country, that would not exactly be a tough thing to do. And yet people, when you bring that up, they act like that's a bridge too far, and no, it's not. Briefly, if you don't mind me, Ruth Richardson, Representative 52B, joining us really quick. Just quickly, your thoughts yesterday on Governor Walz's announcement about the schools. Obviously, I think a well-thought-out plan, and as well, I mean, a lot of power. Obviously, the state set some standards, but there's a lot of power within the individual school districts as well.
Sure. I know that Minnesotans have been sitting on pins and needles waiting for that announcement to come out, the school districts and families as well. And I think that we just need to really highlight the fact that when we are in the midst of a global pandemic and not always sure what's coming around the next corner in terms of increases in cases and beginning to see younger folks, testing positive as well. I think that there was a lot of wisdom and ensuring that there was the opportunity for every community to take a look at their specific circumstances to determine what those next steps were going to be, and to be able to have the opportunity to meaningfully engage with the families within their districts. It was great to see a number of the school districts putting out calls for listening sessions, surveys to families as well, to ensure that they can make decisions based upon not only the science, but also based upon where that particular community is at as well.
I want to drive people to help you if at all possible here. I know I make the same speech every time I talk to a Democrat of the day. Help your local Democrat, by all means. Help your local Democrat. But we need another term with Ruth in the House, for goodness sakes. Ruth Richardson is 52B. I should mention that's Mendota Heights area, correct?
Yes, that's correct. I have Mendota Heights, Inver Grove Heights, section of Egan, and also Sunfish Lake.
We need to make sure we hold that seat. We need Ruth in the House. This is a no-brainer. If you can donate, if you can volunteer, please do. Representative, your website is ruthforhouse.com, correct?
That's it. Thank you so much, Matt.
My pleasure. ruthforhouse.com. Ruth Richardson, representative for 52B, Democrat of the Day. Thank you very much for the time. I do appreciate it. We'll take a break. Come on back. It's the Matt McNeil Show right here on AM 950.